Good day and thank you for joining Civilnet. Today at the studios is Professor Ohanyan. She's the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Affairs at Stonehill College and the author of 2 books on conflict management, conflicts in general, political science. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
And seeing the work you've done on general, politics and the conflicts, and seeing that you have all the space on what the theory is or what the situation is, I want to try to place the Karabakh conflict within the knowledge of political science, theory of political science, where it stands. Is it somehow a classical conflict? Is it something that out of the ordinary, or it's something that reflects the new ways that conflicts, regional conflicts, are taking on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the international relations as a field of study, international politics, has been so much focused on understanding conditions of war and peace. The field itself of international relations is relatively young. It depends really the way where you'll start the counting. But by some accounts, you would say it's less than a century old. The scholars will. There's a realization within the field of international relations theory that we know more about war and violence and armed conflict, and we know less about peace. Actually, we do have variety. The vocabulary for understanding war and conflict is much more diverse than a vocabulary describing what peace is. So in that respect, Nagorno Karabakh conflict, to a certain extent, confirms some of the trends and patterns on warfare and armed what used to be considered, what is actually described as a low-intensity conflict in many databases. So in that respect, Nagorno Karabakh conflict is very much tends to be grouped by relatively similar conflict, but most of those databases look at the number of people who die per year as a result of violence. When it comes to the study of peace building, the study of building peace process, I would argue the field of international relations is very much behind. And unfortunately here, again, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict demonstrates that if you look at the peace processes, there is not a whole lot of innovation in terms of the formats, parties that are involved. So one could argue that in terms of the peace building, in terms of building peace processes that work and sustain, the very disappointing state around Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, or any conflict surrounding in South Caucasus as well as the Balkans. Now people are worried about the reignition of the Northern Ireland conflict as a result of the Brexit. So there is less theory, there's not enough theory, there is less understanding as to how to build processes that are politically feasible and they're also sustainable. Just few statistics do indicate that less than, more than actually half of peace agreements, peace agreements do not fail within 2 or 3 years. So in this respect, with applying some of that scholarship to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, I always found it frustrating that there is, whether in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, international mediators, there is this really unrealistic expectation that there's going to be this big bargain, this peace agreement, and it's going to solve all the problems. Even if there is an agreement, it requires a lot of work, and my fear is that over the past 2 decades, there has not been enough attention paid to building structures, confidence building measures that could sustain if there was a peace agreement to implement.
And in comparison to other similar conflicts in the region, were they more prepared for peace or a resolution than Nagorno Karabakh? Could we say that, or was the international community more ready to help create the infrastructure for peace?
The analysts would argue that Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is somewhat different than the other conflicts in South Caucasus, and again, it really depends who you ask as to who is even a conflict party in the conflict in Georgia. Is it Russia? The Georgians will argue that the other conflict party is Russia. assuming that the conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia are really fueled by Russia, which is not an accurate depiction, I would argue, of what's happening on the ground. There's some real issues and real parties that need to be considered. So in that respect, Nagorno Karabakh conflict is somewhat different. In terms of the attention paid to it, I would argue that there's not enough attention paid to Nagorno Karabakh conflict in the Western media, and this is an argument that has been voiced by analysts, very careful analysts of Nagorno Karabakh conflict, who will write pieces in Western media arguing that it is important to pay more attention to the Nagorno Karabakh conflict before it becomes a global security threat. And these conflicts are not fixed. They're very dynamic. Sources that have produced the Nagorno Karabakh conflict are very different from the sources that fuel Nagorno Karabakh conflict. And unfortunately, the conflict does have a very real propensity to become a global security threat in terms of linking up to creating conflict clusters. The Syria conflict is very much internationalized, as we see with the terrorist attacks in Europe and very recently in Ankara. The question is whether Armenia will be able to make that argument, and Azerbaijan also needs to make that argument, that more attention needs to be paid on this conflict in terms of investing more political capital, more attention to resolution. Ultimately, the OSCE mediators have been, I think, successful in keeping the violence manageable. If there is a better, I can't think of a better word of describing it, and I think any loss of a life as a result of a man-made as a result of a conflict, which is a man-made disaster, is a loss. OSCE Minsk Group has succeeded in really keeping parties at the table. Ultimately, the Western mediators will always point out that it is the parties themselves, conflict parties themselves, that have to make the ultimate calls.
So when we started the conversation, you were talking about how they calculate the conflict or the intensity of the conflict. Yes, and is there any mechanism? And also, I know that we've been trying to measure democracy, yes, or freedom of speech. Or is there any way of calculating peace or the potential of peace in the region? Is there something
That is a great question. Actually, there's an indicator called Global Peace Index, and they just issued their report for 2016, the year 2016. What the indicator does is measures peace and criminality and war and violence. So it's a really broad category. But it is helpful, and we can argue and challenge as to how effective it is as a measure, how accurate it is. But still, with every measure, like whether we're measuring good governance and any other indicators, poverty and economic democracy, level of democracy, those measures, indeed, it's very easy to criticize them, and some of the criticism is justified, but still giving some marker and understanding as to where societies fall, where states fall, is very helpful. It gives, any statistics that is produced in such a way is useful for activists or people involved in diplomacy to use and make a claim that no, violence is not the way to solve a conflict because it costs. The Global Peace Index, for example, the report calculated that the costs related to violence actually exceed the amount spent on foreign direct investment by several times. I think the numbers were about over around 11% of global GDP is actually gets lost as a result of the conflict. So measures are important.
One of the similar indexes that I think the global report was that in 2014, this was the 2014 one, where it says there's no war in Armenia. Because then I realized that, yes, by default, there is de facto there isn't, but there is at the same time. Armenia is not a direct party, therefore the report just actually puts Armenia pretty high, yes, on a scale where we should be, because as someone living here, right, we feel war, yeah, and we have losses, right, in the army. So I don't know, the use of such reports or the accuracy of them, have they been challenged?
That question actually goes to show as to, when it comes, remember we started the conversation as to how little we know about peace. We usually understand peace as the absence of war. That definitely is not the case. Looking at South Caucasus with several of its unresolved conflicts, even if there is no violence, even if the conflicts do not reignite, even if we take the, even before the four-day war, there are enormous costs to unresolved conflicts to the region. And this argument also needs to be made. Very often in diplomatic conversations, diplomatic discussions, whether conversing with Azerbaijanis or any party, it is portrayed that Armenia is the losing side because of the blockade by Azerbaijan and by Turkey, and it's just actually incorrect. It's not just Armenia that is losing from unresolved conflicts and the blockade, but Azerbaijan itself. Georgia as well is a big loser. It might be a short-term gains for Georgia for being the only country in the region having contacts with Armenia and Azerbaijan. But if you're an investor, you're not going to come and invest just in Georgia or just in Armenia or just in Azerbaijan. Overall, investors do tend to look at the region in general. If there is any instability, they're going to stay away. So this is definitely an argument that needs to be made. World Bank has issued a study. IMF has actually calculated what are the costs lost in GDP for Armenia and for Azerbaijan as a result of the conflict. What are the costs of existing economic borders? And these studies are done in the context of South Caucasus, in the context of Central Asia, in the context of Africa. And unfortunately, South Caucasus does top the list in many accounts. World Economic Forum actually did do issued a very useful report on this. The World Economic Forum, actually, I think the one in 2014 met in Baku. It was financed by SOCAR. That report even acknowledges quite concretely as to what are the losses to each country. What gains would there be if the conflict were resolved to the economies of all three countries? So that argument, those calculations, unintended consequences or uncalculated costs of warfare are enormous.
And is it only to the economy, the loss of the economy, or also as far as democracy is suffering in the region?
You said it, yeah. Yes. There's all kinds of research that the persistence in violence and conflict do produce, they entrench the military, they do produce declines in democracy. This has been observed in Central America and many other parts of the world that suffer from unresolved armed conflicts.
You've been educating future political scientists, international relations specialists. What's the new generation going to be like? Is there a difference in the new generation that's being educated, given all the changes in perception and media and everything else and the world? Are they going to be different?
I think few things definitely stay the same. And these are going to be my own opinions and might be subjective. But I think one gold standard is the ability to do research, whether it's a political scientist, it's a sociologist, we're talking about a sociologist, the social sciences in general. Carrying out building careful research agendas, articulating research questions, figuring out what kind of data to deploy, essentially producing evidence-based scholarship that can inform, that can produce detailed policy prescriptions. I think that is a gold standard in my view, and at least that is the perspective that I try to do it in my classrooms in the United States or working here in Armenia. We just finished our local Roots of Global Peace conference. This was an international student conference. It was sponsored by Stonehill College of the United States, Eurasia International University in Armenia, and Eurasia Partnership Foundation. Stonehill College worked closely with Eurasia Partnership Foundation in organizing the conference, and in particular, the key objective here was to create space for our younger junior scholars in bringing their research and getting useful feedback from the discussants. The discussants were mostly from Armenia. These are top-notch analysts that were just amazing and thoughtful and generous in sharing their feedback. I mean, I would like to name some, but I'm afraid to forget some names. But we had Gevorg Gabriel and Richard Geragosian, Varham Matevosian, Isabella Sarkisian, and Artak Ayuns, and I'm sure Naira Sahakian, I'm sure I'm forgetting. There are also professors from Stonehill College.
I'm going to interrupt you so that it will be, you didn't forget.
Yeah, okay, good. Very good. Thanks for saving me.
How about for a political scientist taking sides or taking stands?
Yes.
Is that an acceptable practice? Is that a personal preference, or it comes at a risk of, you know, losing some of your professional profile?
That's such a great question, and I feel so strongly about it. When I just finished my graduate work, I'm sorry, I finished my coursework. I was about to start my dissertation, and I was studying at Syracuse University. I actually, very consciously, I did not take up a project close to Armenia, and I did not take anything related to Armenia because I wasn't sure, I was too young, I wasn't sure I would have the professionalism to produce value-free, unbiased scholarship. So I have looked at Bosnia and Herzegovina, so the first round of my research has been very much focused on the Balkan conflict. After spending several years and visiting the region, I did become attached to the country, to the subject that you study. Having achieved a certain level of professionalism, I now realize that I don't believe in value-free science. I think we do bring in our biases, but at the same time, being aware of those biases and valuing good evidence-based, good research allows us to keep those biases at bay. And I'm ethnically Armenian. If I want to produce something relevant and useful for the region, and if I want to Azerbaijanis to take me seriously, I need to demonstrate that my research is sound, that my research agenda is sound, which is why methods of data collection, research designs are critical. So it wasn't until, what, 5 years ago that I dared to look at the South Caucasus and that I dared to look at Nagorno Karabakh conflict. So it's a challenge for researchers, but I think we just have to be aware of our biases and learn to manage them as much as possible and being open about it.
I'm going to ask the same question from the other end. How about political scientists who are trying to be so politically correct, so not taking sides, whereas sometimes even in conversations you understand that they're not even able to speak freely. Is this taking away from their value as a political scientist?
Yeah, I think the other component of that, because it's a continuation, I would argue, to the previous question that you asked. In addition to being able to produce really good research and scholarship, and once you look at your data and it says that the sky is blue and this table is brown, you should be able to take ownership of your idea and really advocate for it, unless there is alternative evidence that refutes your idea. In this respect, going back to your question about what is a contemporary political science, I think it is important. What I do tell my Armenian and American students, it is important for political scientists, once you created the research, it is important for you to be able to produce policy implications. But to do that, you have to be able to advocate for your ideas. That would mean, sometimes it would mean you are not trying to be impartial and kind of apply this arbitrary, sometimes forced, trying to be fair to both sides. I don't think that is helpful as research for social sciences. Researchers are also policy advocates. So going back to the question of what should a contemporary political scientist be able to do? Contemporary political scientists should be able to really in my view, embrace its role as a citizen and really advocate for ideas that they think will help to solve a particular question. And speaking to policy communities, policy-oriented communities, which is very tough. Writing an academic paper in some respects might be much more easy than writing a policy brief, which are shorter, targeted audience, or writing a piece for broader audiences. Very difficult to communicate one's scholarship to people who might not have enough background on it, but yet you're trying to reach those communities. And it's a skill that I would argue that graduate schools in the United States have not been doing particularly well. Now there is a realization that they need to train graduate students in speaking to broader audiences outside of their narrow specialization. That is being recognized, and it's something that I also prioritize when working in Armenia or in the United States.
All right, thank you very much for speaking with us. It's really a lot of questions, because a lot of the time we run to political scientists for advice and whatever is happening, and also to be able to understand what the domain itself should be or could be is very important. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
Great. And we thank the viewers for joining us as well.